and welcome to the Vicars Watch Dibley,
the podcast where real priests talk about pop culture and what we've learned about faith, life and the church. We've watched Dibley and now we're watching everything else. I'm Kate.
I'm Ross.
And I'm Ruthie, and today we're talking about the film Four Weddings and a Funeral. We discuss the different weddings, the gaffes that are made and whether we've made gaffes like that in our own weddings that we've done, and we talk especially about the funeral and the queer relationship that's hinted at in this film and where things might look different if it was filmed today.
Holy happy hello to you all.
Hello.
Hello.
We're in our vicarages and you're listening in. We're ready and raring to talk about four weddings and a funeral. But first, Ruthie is going to lead us in some notices. Ruthie, what do you have us for today?
Well, I just thought I'd tell you, as I'm doing a funeral after this recording, but it's a slightly unusual funeral. I was wondering if you could help me out and if you've done anything like this before and if you have any advice. So, the funeral that I'm doing after our recording is for a rabbit. So, one of the girls from church, it was her birthday yesterday and her rabbit died on the same day, and I said, I'm so sorry, would you like me to come and say some words? And she was like, yeah, I'd really like that. So I'm going over to do a funeral for the rabbit. Now, have you done any pet funerals before? And what are the do's and don'ts?
Ruthie, you know the answer to this because we all did one together.
We did. Yes.
It was for Jenny's budgerigar.
For Jenny's budgie.
Yeah. Was that Jim? That was Jim's funeral, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Nathan led that very nicely. Yeah. He used the alternative service book, which is no longer used, really, for worship. Are you going to robe?
No, I'm wearing my dog collar.
Yeah.
And it's so cold here, but I don't think I'll put on robes. I have previously done one for a goldfish, again of a close friend, and her goldfish died. And we buried the goldfish, put it in a matchbox, and we gave thanks for the goldfish's life, for all the lovely things we've had from the goldfish. And we said thank you to God for the goldfish. So I'm thinking I'll probably do something similar. In fact, I have a book. I believe it's Nat's book, actually, that's called it's Consecrations and Blessings, and it gives lots of prayers for different occasions. And there's a section on pets, and there's one for a new pet, there's one for a sick pet, and there's one for the funeral of the pet. So I think I'll be using that one today.
Yeah.
But these are the unusual things you end up doing in ministry.
Yeah, so it's interesting because theologically and technically, according to canon law, we're not supposed to do funerals for pets. Though I would argue that what we're doing is we are doing a ritual of mourning to pastorally care, particularly for a child who this may be their first encounter with death. That's really kind of real for them. I think the death of a pet is unfortunately sometimes more real for a child than the death of a grandparent sometimes, because especially if you don't see if you only see your grandparents a few times a year, whereas the pet, you may have even discovered them in their bed, not moving. Oh.
So, what would you advise, Ross?
Well, I think I would want to try and take some lead from the child, and actually, there's something about almost the role play of funeral, and. I'm reminded of an episode of Outnumbered where Karen wants to do a funeral for their hamster, and she and it just cuts to her doing it on her own in the back garden, and she makes up her prayers, and she, so using it as an opportunity for the child to role play that grief, and maybe to take a leadership role in some ways, and sort of say, hey, do you want to say something now about your memories of the rabbit? And I mean, in terms of theology, I tend to lean towards all things are redeemed in Christ. New creation is for all creation.
Yeah.
So I tend to lean into that theologically when we had a pet service, and the big question is, do dogs go to heaven? I mean, it's fairly reductive, but
there
you go.
It's one of those interesting things which you have to do. You can't just dismiss, particularly with children, because children don't differentiate really between whether it's a beloved pet or whether it's whether it's a human, and it's really important to deal with well, because I'm just reminded of an episode of Red Dwarf, to bring TV and film into this, where the main character Lister talks about how when his dad died, he was told that the dad went to the same place as the goldfish who had passed away, and so he used to spend his time in the toilet, kind of talking to the loo, because he thought his dad, because they'd flushed with the goldfish down the loo, and so he spent his time talking down the toilet bowl because he was thinking he was talking to his dad. Which obviously that's a comedy series, but that's also kind of that, if we help children process grief and, like Ross said, role play that sense of funeral and ritual, then it kind of helps prepare them later on.
Exactly. So I just thought I'd give that as a little notice to show this is sometimes the things that we end up doing, and I'm very honoured that I was asked to do it. So of course I will go. Yeah.
And
so we've got some more funerals a funeral to talk about, and a few more weddings.
Which, to be honest, that just feels like every day in ministry, because at the moment I've got 2 funerals on the books and 9 weddings. 9 couples are preparing for marriage. So, that's just being a vicar. But we have watched a film called 4 Weddings and a Funeral, which isn't from a clergy perspective, but from a group of friends' perspective. Ross, tell us about 4 Weddings and a Funeral.
Sure. Well, there are a couple of reasons why I wanted to talk about it. Partly because it does have a lot of links to The Vicar of Dibley, our namesake. It is a film that was released in 1994, which is the same year that The Vicar of Dibley was released. Both the film, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, and Vicar of Dibley were written by Richard Curtis, who is also the mind behind Notting Hill and About a Boy and others. Lots of and generally like Red Nose Day comic relief stuff.
Yeah. General legend.
Lots of British rom-coms from the 90s. And comedy series. He's had his finger in many pots, as it were. Yes,
and a lot of rom-com pots.
Romantic pots.
And comedy pots.
Ooh. Romantic comedy pots.
So 4 Weddings and a Funeral also features James Fleet, who plays Hugo in The Vicar of Dibley. And he's playing exactly the same kind of person.
Yeah.
Sort of foppish, rich... young man hoping to fall in love, or at the very least be married off by the end of the story.
One major difference being that he doesn't have a stern father but a stern sister.
Yes, his stern sister is played by the fabulous Kristen Scott Thomas, who's
she's amazing,
really fabulous. Also, 4 Weddings and a Funeral has a vicar in it. Rowan Atkinson is playing a young curate or seminarian. It's tough to work out whether he's Anglican or Roman Catholic in my mind. But in the film, he does his very first wedding. You know, Rothy.
Yes. Well, I assume they're Anglican because they use the Book of Common Prayer for the services. And, do we want to talk about that particular wedding to begin with? Because, bless him, Rowan Atkinson, it's his first ever wedding, isn't it? And he messes it up a bit, to put it bluntly.
So Rowan Atkinson plays this new priest. The reason I'm confused as to whether he was Roman Catholic or Anglican is because he wears a biretta. And he follows 2 bishops into the church. And that struck me as odd, because it was like, okay, that wouldn't be a common thing that I think you would find at an Anglican wedding. But it is also important to note that the cast of characters in this film do come from a primarily upper middle posh class. So maybe that's fine. Yeah. Maybe that's what would be expected.
And I would like to say, if there's bishops in the family, that might be a reason why there's bishops in regalia.
So this is his first wedding because he's a family friend. He's a bishop's kid.
Yeah. Because he was a guest at the... So we're first introduced to this character. He's a guest at the first wedding in the film. And he says, I'm training to be a priest. And Hugo, Tom, that conglomerated character, his sister Fiona, flirts with this trainee priest because I think she enjoys his reactions, that he's tremendously uncomfortable. Then
he talks about sex and condoms.
Yeah, but then he is presiding at the next wedding we see. I think we assume that, yes, he's a family friend. He must be some sort of family friend.
No, they say he's a family friend. It's his first time.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. So,
and that's why he does the gig.
Yeah. And if they are middle class, upper middle class British, those are the sort of connections you might have. If they were super upper class, then maybe Catholic might be more an option. But
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Richard Curtis knows a bit about the Anglican Church, but aesthetically, it looks pretty to have a person either side on the shots that has a nice pointy hat on.
Oh, you cynic.
So,
pointy hat!
Knowing it'd be weird to have two bishops, and neither of them seem to be involved in the service at all, that they're there for that. Yeah.
I think it's also meant to make sure that each of the weddings looks different. Because the first one, we've just got a vicar in choir dress.
Village church.
Right? In a village church.
Yeah.
Next one, we're in a bigger church in London. It's more prestigious. The next one is up in Scotland in like a chapel on an estate.
Yeah.
And then the final one is, again, a London church, right?
Yes, but with the seating in traverse style, either side, which was very cool. Anyway.
I listened to an interview when I was prepping for us talking about this, because I didn't manage to watch all the film, but I've seen it before, saw some clips, and I watched an interview with Richard Curtis about writing and the process of writing and how he started writing for weddings and a funeral. So he'd done loads of stuff with Rowan Atkinson, so him and Rowan Atkinson were pals, and then he wrote this because he'd realised he'd been to 65 weddings in the past 11 years or something like that. It was a lot. And he gave this really interesting interview about the writing process, and he was asked a question about any advice for young writers, and he said about writing what you love and what you know, and not just playing to what are trends at the time. And so writing about the things that interest you. And clearly he had an interest in weddings from the amount that he'd gone to, and therefore can write about it really, really well. And I just thought that was really interesting from Richard Curtis. And he's brilliant at writing it because he knows the stuff.
Yeah.
He knows the kind of order. There weren't so many gaffes about, well, that wouldn't happen in a wedding. Oh, well, there are some bits.
There are a couple things where stuff is out of order, yeah.
But its structure's fairly good, and people are mostly wearing the right thing, and knows how to do a church wedding, and so I just think it's brilliant writing, and Richard Curtis is amazing.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those gaffes that he picks up on for comedic value, which are all sort of real in one way or another. So the first one we encounter, aside from the best man running late, is that the best man doesn't have a ring, so they have to find a random ring from the guests to use. And in this case, they are only using one ring rather than two rings for a wedding, which that's traditional.
Actually, they talk about the ring in singular, but two rings are produced for both the bride and the groom.
Yeah.
So the bride ends up with a wonderful plastic heart, multicolored one, and then the groom has a skull
dragon. Thing. It's amazing.
I wasn't watching close enough. I just heard the priest say, can I have a ring, please?
Yeah. And it was a really traditional thing where actually only the groom gives a ring to the bride.
Yeah.
Or, I think it's that way around.
It is that way around, yeah.
Yes.
Which, when I prepare wedding couples, I say it's not about... Although it can be interpreted as a symbol of belonging, I see it as it's supposed to be something valuable. It's a protection for the bride that she can have something to sell if her husband dies or disappears. It's something something valuable. But no, like historically, that's something across cultures that was done. A bride would be given something valuable as part of the wedding, which was a protection for her.
It's a sort of security guarantee in case of emergency. She can pawn it and...
Well, go to the Bible. So the story about the woman who loses a coin and searches the whole house for a coin. Yeah. I've been told that it's supposed to be a coin from a veil she would wear, which is a wedding gift. And each of those coins is supposed to be, again, for her security, should she become a widow.
Yeah. It's her dowry, isn't it? She's supposed to be wearing.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I knew about the veil thing. I hadn't realised that there was the marriage security element to it. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that was... we just diverted there. So that was one of the gaffes, the ring not being produced. And the big one is Rowan Atkinson, our lovely curate, getting the words wrong.
Is that wedding number 2?
Have we ever done that? Have we had maybe not quite stupendous an error?
I've not had a gaffe with words at a wedding, but I have had a Haribo ring produced at the can I have the rings, please?
Well, I use Haribo at the wedding rehearsal, but not on wedding itself.
Yeah, no. So that was a wedding where they only had one ring. It was a traveller wedding, and he had a ring for her, but not vice versa. But a Haribo ring was produced at the same time when I said, "Hey, can I have the rings, please?" Like, okay, we're not going to bless that. You can take that away.
That's a tasty snack.
Yeah. That was one of my most stressful weddings.
Rings?
No.
I've dropped rings before, but luckily I was able to catch them.
Not down one of those grates.
They didn't fall down a grate.
Yeah. My one of my previous churches, there was a grate right by the place where the wedding ring, you would hand it over, and my training incumbent had a bit of a joke at best man, and he dropped something in the grate at the time that the rings are being over, and yes, it wasn't as amusing. Well, it was amusing for everyone apart from my training incumbent.
One of my churches used to have one of those grates, but it got covered over because a ring had been dropped previously.
Very wise.
Where do we stand in canon law on rings? So let's say the best man forgets the rings. Should we... Is it allowable to just skip over the blessing and giving of rings? And say, actually, we'll go back to that bit later. But here's the whole thing about with this ring. I don't have it here.
I have no idea, and therefore I'm not going to comment, because I'll get it wrong.
So I don't think there is canon provision for this. Technically speaking, the exchanging of rings is not a legal aspect of a wedding marriage service. In fact, most of what we do isn't a legal aspect. The legal aspect is sort of the exchanging of vows before witnesses and then signing a document. In terms of Christian marriage, exchanging of rings is part of our traditions. I think I would be tempted to either say, with these rings we will exchange at a later date, I would on the fly adapt what they're saying, so they make the promises without the exchanging of rings, and we say, and at a later date we'll come back and we will bless the rings and we will renew these promises. I wouldn't... The thing is, in terms of using substitute rings, I know people, including my parents, who've had to have rings replaced.
Yeah.
And
my dad's on his third.
And like they might get those rings re-blessed, they might not. So
the symbol is the thing rather than the object.
Yeah, I think
itself.
It's a symbol rather than the actual physical ring.
Ruthie.
I did a really nice wedding blessing where I blessed a ring for him to wear, where he'd, him and his son, they'd been in a boat accident, the whole family, and he'd had to have his ring cut off as part of it, and it had been horrible for the whole family. But using the gold from the ring that they were able to salvage, and the gold, I think it was from his mum's ring, they reforged the ring using the two different metals, and so as part of the wedding blessing, I blessed this new ring for him to wear, which was really lovely.
It's an interesting thing, because I've considered for a while that if I ever get married, I'm not keen to wear a ring. Not because of some great statement, some feminist statement, but because when I was 17, I did some first aid training, and they showed a picture of certain injuries you can get involving your wedding rings getting caught in machinery. And I said, nope, I am not wearing rings, ever.
I've friends who have tattoo rings because she works in a operating theatre, and so is always scrubbing up all the time. And so they got rings tattooed on their ring finger. They have bands as well, but most of the time they have their tattoos that get topped up every so often. So yeah, there's an option. You can get a tat instead, Kate, if you like.
So let's talk novelty rings for a moment. So let's say someone produces the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, or indeed a skull ring, or some other kind of novelty ring to be their wedding ring. Do we, as vicars, discourage that? I mean, Ross, you've turned down a Haribo before. I think we know why you turned down a Haribo, because it's edible and it will disappear within moments. But if someone were to produce a non-standard ring, and a novelty ring, rather than, let's say, someone wanted wooden rings, or just a ring that looks a bit different. Do we think that's appropriate? I
think the risk you run is what qualifications make something novelty. There are lots of different materials with which you can make rings. And if someone were to produce the Ring of Power from The Lord of the Rings, how would we know? Because at first glance, it's a gold ring.
True.
Now, something that may be emblazoned with a skull and crossbones on it, to some extent, you might say, well, actually, there's something here about till death us do part.
There you go. Nice.
So I think I would err on the side of, hey, this is your marriage.
Yeah.
This is what you have chosen as a symbol of your life together.
True.
And we don't vet them. We don't vet the rings.
Yeah, we don't vet. We don't even see them usually until the moment they're given to us.
Oh, I tell them to bring them to the rehearsal.
Oh, do you?
So that they can get used. Yeah, I say bring it to the rehearsal, so you've got it with you, and you can. It also helps normally the groomsmen to remember that he needs to bring the rings, but so that they've got hold of it and they can. So I do see them, but I have just thought of, do you remember the Gavin and Stacey episode where Pete and Dawn get there? They renew their vows, and Pete has this horrific bling ring.
Oh, yeah.
And Dawn's absolutely mortified by it. But it's people's choices, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
it's their choices.
Yeah.
Like I said, at rehearsals, I use Haribo, mostly because it's supposed to be like a humour intention relieving thing.
Nice.
And then it's also,
Everyone's a bit
you can
nervous
give
at the
any
rehearsal,
kids
aren't
there, they've got a little snack afterwards, so they can feel involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Very
that's
nice.
rings. Let's go back to Mr. G. Has anyone ever got the words wrong? I once forgot to do the preface, but then I snuck it in just before the vows instead.
Oh, well done.
And it was a very hot day. It was a very hot day. Sometimes your brain just goes bleh on a really hot day.
Yeah.
I once forgot to do the "you may now kiss each other" moment, which isn't in the book, so it's not like I missed it, but it's something that some people expect. So, yeah. Anyway, I mean, whatever. I checked with them during the hymn, and they were fine with it not having happened. So,
yeah. I always find it awkward as the vicar saying snog.
I asked them. So, I mean, this was a bit awkward. I went in the hymn and said, "Hey, would you like this?" And she didn't want to do it. And he was like, oh, no, tell her, we've got to do it. It's part of the religion. I was like, if she doesn't want to kiss you, I'm not going to make her. Consent matters, even in marriage.
That's a small red flag there.
Yeah, I mean, they were very young. I think they're very young. There was a lot going on.
Well, Ruthie, you've mentioned before on the podcast that you, at wedding prep, you give couples advice about their kiss, and I've adopted this.
Have you? You started telling people how to kiss?
Well, no.
Yeah.
I tell them they want to practice and think about what type of kiss.
Lots of moisture. Yeah, I do tell them to do that because it's... not trying to be the creepy vicar, but... yeah, I was seeing a wedding couple the other day and was talking about it. And it's just like, guys, have a little think about this. Because you don't want to make it awkward for us all. Whichever end of the scale you go, where you kiss like you don't know each other. And that's actually in 4 Weddings and a Funeral, isn't it? Carrie and... Is it Charlie?
No, not Charlie. Carrie and Marshall?
Charlie.
Which wedding are we on?
Hugh Grant and Andy... McDowell.
Oh yeah, so
they have
Carrie
a talk.
And Charlie.
Yeah, they talk, don't they, in the bedroom about kissing and what's the appropriate level, and that's how they end up sleeping together.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a funny old thing. I can't think of any big gaffes I've done at a wedding. I mean, your first one's always nerve-wracking, isn't it? And I was especially worried about the legal paperwork of thinking, you know, I don't want to mess this up because I don't want to go to prison for getting it wrong, which we're all told about that in training for different things. But I did meet, from the film, one of his middle names is St. John.
Yeah.
And I met a St. John recently, and it is spelled St. John. So I did... did I awkwardly say his name wrong? I'm not sure I did, but I was very aware that I needed to say St. John.
Yeah.
It's St. John.
Names is one of those huge things and that you've got to get right. I find that when I was doing funerals a lot, that was more important to say, what was this person known by?
Yeah.
And,
yes.
And okay, so this was their nickname. Do you want me to call them by the nickname? And for wedding couples, do you want me to call you by, like, in wedding prep I'll call you by your nicknames, but for your wedding day, do you want me to call you by your nickname or by your full name? And then they're like, oh, do you say our middle names at the vows? And it's like, well, legally I don't have to. I won't call you by your nickname when it comes to vows. Like, if you want to be Edward John, you can be Edward John. If you want to just be Edward, you can be Edward, but I won't call you Ed or Teddy.
Yeah. I had a couple like that, and they were really keen to do middle names. He was a bit embarrassed by his middle name, but she was like, no, it's one of the only times, and I think all the groomsmen were like, yeah, his middle name's hilarious, let's do the full thing. So we did. But yeah, I love doing weddings, but I do feel a lot of pressure with them because you know that there are implications if you mess up.
Yeah.
And messing up as in documentation and not saying the vows properly and stuff like that. And we have in this film the classic interrupting at if anyone has an objection and someone states an objection that isn't actually a legal objection. But Hugh Grant still gets punched in the face, so it's all good.
So in the final wedding, which is Hugh Grant, his character Charlie or Charles, getting married to a woman he doesn't necessarily love, or he doesn't love enough because he's actually...
He dated her for a bit, treated her terribly. And she's a bit of a joke character, sort of, world's worst ex trope. She's called Henrietta, and she's played by the fabulous her name's gone straight out of my head. She's Caroline Bingley. But by the actress
There's a lot of Jane Austen in
Anna Chancellor,
who is actually related to Jane Austen. I remember from a documentary.
Oh really?
Yeah. But yeah, so Charlie, we'll get to one of the reasons why, because there's a really interesting part in the movie about that. But his brother, who is hearing impaired and communicates through sign language, he gets Charlie to interpret what he's saying, and he says, "I suspect that the groom is having doubts," which isn't a legal objection, but it does get Charles punched. So.
And it's a nice dramatic moment during the silence. Speak now, if ever hold your peace, and the brother knocks 3 times on the pew to get everyone's attention.
Yeah.
Can we just as well in that moment? Can we stick with this moment for a second rather than the scenario?
Let's stick with that moment.
The vicar is really in Charles's face about this. He's like, "Do you, Charles?
Gossip queen.
Do you have doubts? Do you love another woman?" It's like, "God, blimey."
Yeah, this is the point that you should have taken them aside to go talk about this.
So let's break it down. What would you do?
So I would take them aside, and I think so. This isn't a legal objection. I think actually first I'd say I'd want an indication whether they want to talk about this before getting married. I think they'd need to talk about it before vowing to be faithful to each other. I would, but if both of them say yes, okay, yes, I have feelings for another woman, but but I do love this woman I want to marry, and I've decided to be faithful to her, and I'm going to be true to my vows. I don't think you can't stop them getting married. There's not
no
a legal
objection.
I would advise against it. If you are having any doubts about getting married, if you have any doubts about this contract you're about to enter and your ability to fulfill that contract, wait.
There's something about that moment where the vicar is just interrupting and putting Charles on the spot, where actually on a wedding day everyone is so nervous. As the vicar, you're the MC. You're holding all of the emotion. You are really in charge of a lot of vulnerable people. So actually taking the couple aside, possibly with best man and chief bridesmaid as well, all the people due to be witnesses, into the side room, and then just having that conversation and saying, "Look, okay, this isn't a legal thing. You can go ahead and get married, but you need to decide in this room what you want to do. I'll come back in 5 minutes. I'll get the organist to play some chill music for everyone else, and then if you decide that you're not going to get married, I will be the one who will go out and explain to the congregation in a way that protects the integrity of everybody there."
Yeah, I really like that, and I really like about including the witnesses, and them witnessing that conversation and that decision to either not get married or to go ahead. I think it's also really important. This is where marriage preparation comes in really, really important. Not just that hopefully you've already helped the couple understand that if they have doubts they shouldn't be getting married, but also that you should have a relationship with them where they trust you with this sort of information, and that they trust you to be able to hold that space, to give them that opportunity to say, actually, I think we need to wait to get married, or no, you know me, I've chosen to marry this person, we've talked about our relationship, we've spent time preparing for marriage. So yeah, I think the relationship you build up with a couple through marriage preparation is incredibly important, because it's so obvious when a couple don't have that relationship with the person who's presiding over their marriage.
I think this leads nicely back into kind of a question underpinning the whole film of 4 Weddings and a Funeral, which is about why people get married and some of the pressures around getting married. I was really struck watching the film this time. That it's been years since I've seen it, and I did a little bit of a Google to see how old Hugh Grant was when he played Charles, and he was about 34, 35, which is my age right now.
Really?
And I found that really fascinating because even in the early 90s, that to me feels old to be getting married. And there seems to be a pressure in this friendship group of singletons, or alleged singletons, to, you know, they are these odd singletons. They are, you know, is there a pressure to get married or pressure to stay single, so that they're rebelling against this kind of charade of marriage? What's going on there? And Hugh Grant's character Charles is waiting for the love of his life, and he meets the love of his life, and then he loses the love of his life. And there's this conversation that he has with James Fleet's character Tom, Hugo, about marriage. And Tom's perspective is, well, I think I'm not looking to meet someone to fall in love with. I'll meet somebody who is a nice woman that I can do life with. Sort of idea, which isn't necessarily very romantic at all, but there is a practical side to it.
Yeah.
But what's unhelpful is how that then translates into Charles's journey.
Yeah. So I think the conversation there is based on, and we'll get to this couple later on, which is Matthew and Gareth, and Charlie. They're talking about Charles is saying that when you look at a couple like Matthew and Gareth, you have to believe in true love. And therefore, he's feeling hopeless that he will ever get married because he doesn't think he either thinks he's met that person and she's married someone else, or he doesn't think he can kind of make that step of choice. And he says, you know, to Tom, he says, you know, you have such confidence that you will get married. And this is when Tom says, well, I just always thought I'd meet a nice girl and she wouldn't be sick at the sight of me and would settle down and be happy. And it worked for my parents, I mean, aside from a divorce.
Yes.
Which is, again, there's a class thing there, because Tom is from the upper class. He has a huge
seventh richest family in the
seventh
country.
Richest family, which and historic. Well, I mean, I say historically, even now, marriages are more business, perhaps, or they have been.
Yeah,
within the last 20 years. I mean, if we learn anything about Charles and Diana, it's there's something, and like you said, watching this when we're in our 30s rather than when we're in our teens or 20s is a very different experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I watched it as a young person, I was like, oh, they're all grown-ups. And now I'm in my 30s, I'm like, oh, they're in their 30s, as opposed to being in their 20s, which is a very different experience of going to loads of weddings.
Yeah.
Ruthie.
Another thing I saw with this interview with Richard Curtis, he really didn't want Hugh Grant to play Charlie. So they did the whole casting thing because he wanted someone who would have to work to get married more. So he wanted someone who would have to work to get a relationship, so wouldn't be like the pretty man. And he felt that Hugh Grant looked too good looking, that it would be easy for him to get a girl, whereas he wanted someone who would have to work harder at it. He really wanted Alan Rickman to play that role. Wow. And that would have been a very, very different a very, very different film. But yeah, everyone else thought, no, Hugh Grant's perfect for it. So
that decision then created a character who is a bit of an archetype in film and TV of this, you know, relatively attractive male lead who is quite, you know, intelligent, fairly successful, but just can't seem to make relationships work. We see it with Ross Geller in Friends, with Ted Mosby in How I Met Your Mother, where they're kind of looking for love quite desperately. And that's the thing that's not right in their lives. And that this is the thing that will make their life complete. All of those characters are horrible people.
I was about to say, yeah.
Yes.
But I think what's also interesting is that you it's only with a level of hindsight and with a more contemporary understanding of emotional health, consent, what is a healthy way to treat yourself and other people, that we look back and think, wow, gosh, no, these are really appalling people who are treating women like rubbish.
Yeah, and watching it this time, because I haven't watched it in years. I don't often have the desire to watch 4 Weddings and a Funeral. It's something I've watched a few times and I'm like, yeah, okay. But watching it this time, you sort of start off thinking, he's just a bit useless. He sleeps in when he's the best man, and he's a bit useless, and he's a bit of a fop, but whatever. But then you discover he's got this whole... It's the second wedding where we meet all his exes who hate him.
Yeah.
And you realise, oh...
He talks terribly about all his exes to all of his their next girlfriends. And it's, yeah.
Can I say something controversial then? I don't get the Hugh Grant thing. That he's such a popular romantic lead, and people talk about how attractive they find him in things like Notting Hill, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Sense and Sensibility,
Bridget Jones's
even
Diary.
Bridget Jones, and I just don't get it. I don't get it. It's not for me. Doesn't sizzle my bacon.
He has become he has become self-aware though. He knows this, and he has fought to break that stereotype. So he was recently in a film, Heretic, which I haven't watched it, but I've seen it's now available to watch. Now
available to stream near you.
Which I want to watch because I'm sure I saw an interview where he was talking about really wanting to break free of the romantic lead, and I think he's done this interview in various forms multiple times over the last decade or so.
Paddington.
He took a bit of a break from movies. I mean, there was a lot going on, I think, in his personal life as well, because there was so much fame around him in the 90s and early noughties. And so he was sort of then a bit on the back burner for a little while, and he'd been phone hacked in the scandals. But he's had a really interesting resurgence over the last couple of years with Paddington 2 as well.
Good villain.
Yeah, he's playing villains a lot more now.
Yeah, and I think he's having a great time doing that. I think it's... I mean, most actors will say they prefer playing the villains because they're juicier roles to play. And I can imagine that most of the characters that he plays are very similar in the 90s.
I think there was a lot of hype in the 90s about Hugh Grant. He was kind of the archetype of what... This is going to sound terrible. What Americans think British men are like.
Sure. Yeah.
Floppy hair and, well, yes. Oh.
When you watch media from the States, when there is a British male character, he often falls into the Hugh Grant archetype of being kind of affable and posh, but also scruffy or whatever.
Yeah. Clumsy and charming.
And charming.
Which is exactly what Ross is.
Ross is.
You are our lead.
Our main lead.
Slightly clumsy, charming, floppy hair.
Did Hugh Grant basically create that archetype? Is there anybody who kind of precedes him in that? Or did he create the trope?
He hated that hair. I saw an interview with him, and I think he did kind of lead the way with that trope and had that haircut that was very popular, but he hated it, but it was something that people wanted in the movies, and doing that kind of bumbling but charming, and I'm so British and repressed, but actually I want to give you a good scene to, and all that kind of thing.
Which in the end led to a number of movies that were exactly the same. I've got to admit, I cannot differentiate between Notting Hill and 4 Weddings in my brain.
They've got a lot in common.
There are so many overlaps in terms of the side female sister character who is basically Alice from Vicar of Dibley, Scarlett in 4 Weddings, and a character played by Emma Chambers in Notting Hill. But there's just so much overlap with all of the archetypal characters in this.
But that's like a mark of Richard Curtis's style. It's the warm nostalgia and fuzziness of this. You know, there's going to be a comedy vicar at some point. There are these kind of characters you expect, and it's some people might not like that, but I like that warm fuzziness of kind of, I recognise that kind of character and how they act, and there'll be these different things as part of it. And I think that's just part of who Richard Curtis is as a writer.
It's kind of that sitcom thing where you take your regular cast of characters and each week you put them in a different scenario and you see what comedy emerges. And actually it's like, what if our character falls in love with someone at one wedding, but at the next wedding she's married to someone else already? What if this character falls in love with Prime Minister and fell in love with the secretary? What if he fell in love with
his secretary?
What if he owns a bookshop and falls in love with a Hollywood starlet? And you push those characters into these scenarios to see what the machine brings out.
Okay, let's talk about then something that is a bit more different and what I think is the unique aspect of this film, which is Matthew and Gareth. Which, if this had been written by Russell T Davies, this would be the main storyline.
Russell T Davies is a gay television writer, most popularly known recently for Doctor Who, but has written for lots of different media and lots of queer media as well. He wrote Queer as Folk, which I think was late 90s, possibly early 90s. And lots of other pieces more much It's a Sin.
And we get a hint at a storyline which I think has so much to it. Ross, tell us about Matthew and Gareth.
So Matthew and Gareth are played by Gareth is played by Simon Callow, and Matthew is played by John Hannah, and they are a part of this big friendship group, and it transpires that they are a gay couple. It's never said in those words, but they are always together. They love each other very dearly, and they're both very different, and I would say very kind of grounded, realistic portrayals of what it might look like to be gay in the 90s. You've got Simon Callow as your sort of over-the-top, gregarious party man who loves everyone and has a roaring laugh. He really enjoys laughing loudly. He's a confirmed bachelor sort of stereotype, really. And then you've got Matthew, played by John Hannah, much more quietly spoken, mild-mannered. And they're at all of these different weddings. But at the third wedding in Scotland, we see Simon Callow's character Gareth suffer a heart attack and die at the reception. And there's a little scene after that where you see Charles going through the crowd of people at the reception to find Matthew to share the news. We then cut immediately to the funeral from the name, For Weddings and a Funeral. And that's fascinating. I can't identify where it is in the country. There is a landmark bridge. There was a lot that I found watching the film this time that I would never have noticed as a young person watching this film. Yeah. As a media literate gay man, I see more now, let's put it that way. You move from this really privileged film where you have got extravagant weddings in Somerset and in London and in Edinburgh castles, all in churches and all with huge dresses and flowers and all of that. And suddenly you cut from there to a really urban, sort of working class community and sort of suburbia, and the funeral itself does take place in a small chapel, but right behind it there's a huge factory with smoke going up. You get shots of people who are at the funeral, and they're not characters you ever see again, and you don't get that so much at the weddings, but you get these sort of intimate shots of people at the funerals.
Really
I got the parents of Gareth, but also just a couple of random men.
Yeah.
One of them is black, and that occurred to me that, oh, wait a minute, this might be the only black person in the film.
Yeah.
But there's something about seeing those men that made me think, oh, this is the nod to the gay community that Gareth and Matthew are a part of.
Yeah.
And then thinking about it from the 90s, this is straight into that wake of the AIDS epidemic of the 80s. So it was something that I found more moving and poignant this time. I mean, the first time I watched Four Weddings and a Funeral, I never realised that they were gay. Because I had no image of what gay was, and it was never explained. The only way it is alluded to is Matthew is called his very close friend. And then when Tom and Charles have a walk after the funeral together. Great male mental health moment, I thought, where Tom says, Charlie, walk, and they go for a walk together to talk. Great mental health moment. Yeah. But as a part of it, one of them says to the other, all this time we've thought we're all single in this friendship group, but it turns out that two of us have been basically married. So I found that really, really striking, that actually in this full-on world of big marriages and big weddings and what does marriage mean and look like, we do have this gay couple who go where that encounters loss, and yet that relationship is never named, it's never celebrated or marked in any verbal way.
It is heartbreaking.
And I think it's worth saying that actually the church is still in a place where it will not solemnize, recognize, celebrate fully what these relationships are.
Yeah. I just looked up, when did civil partnerships start in the UK? Because before marriage, we had civil partnerships. And that was 2005. And then marriage was finally allowed in 2014.
Yeah. Well, there was a sequel sort of thing or reunion. Wasn't
there, for comic relief?
This was in 2019. One Red Nose Day and a Wedding. And that was bringing members of the cast back together for a wedding, I think, of one of the children or something like that. But that turned out, and that was set in a church, but it then transpired at the end that it was a gay couple, a lesbian couple were getting married. And that was in a church. And I think I think maybe the hope was it would do the same sort of thing as The Vicar of Dibley in terms of challenging and bringing a sense of comfort to the idea of gay weddings as it had with female vicars.
Yeah, and if you watch the movie back, if you watch Four Weddings and a Funeral back, with an eye for keeping an eye on the gay relationship, it's a horrible way of saying it, but keep an eye on Matthew and Gareth, because they're the ones, or particularly Gareth especially, who is commenting on marriage as an institution. In the first wedding, we see him pulling some faces, I think. Then in the second wedding, he in the reception, he talks about, we hear him talking about how he has a theory that people only get married to avoid awkward pauses in conversation, that a couple run out of things to say to each other, and so the man thinks, oh, I know what to do, I'll propose, and then they've got something to talk about for the rest of their life. And it's interesting watching Matthew's body language at that point, where there seems, if you're watching, there is a discomfort. And at the same time, you have Fiona sat at a table, and a wedding guest asks her, are you married? And she says, no. And then the wedding guest says, oh, are you a lesbian then? Because this is much more of an interesting thing to ask than, oh, you've never found a right chap. And Fiona's reaction is sort of like, oh, why would you ask that? But then she says, you know what, for 15 minutes when I was a teenager. There's an interesting, very subtle conversation happening.
Yeah. No, it is, and it's good. And I think from a narrative perspective, what's interesting is that as soon as you lose Gareth being this spokesperson about how marriage, is is a bit of a weird thing, or why do we do it? Suddenly Charles falls under the spell of Tom's idea of marriage, of, well, I'll meet someone who doesn't hate me, and it doesn't get sick when she looks at me, and we get married, and that would be that. So it's interesting that as soon as you lose Gareth, Charles's story kind of descends into convention.
Yeah.
And the convention that, we see in that final wedding.
Then really interestingly, in a photo slideshow at the end, firstly, there's a photo that made me cry, and that was Matthew with his new partner. That made me cry.
That's
but then secondly, the photo of Charles and Carrie is not a wedding, whereas all the other characters are weddings or some sort of celebration that is clearly for them. But then with a child, I think an insinuation that Charles and Carrie don't go the conventional route together.
He's not wearing a wedding ring. So I think he's very deliberately pointing at because his hand's in such a way that, like, he's pointing at the camera for the kid to look at, that makes it obvious he's not wearing a wedding ring.
The final speech that he has with Carrie in the rain is, do you want to not marry me? And do you think you would be happy to not marry me for the rest of your life? So there's a way in which that he kind of returns to that Gareth understanding of, okay, well, what is marriage actually? And
is it necessary for commitment?
And actually embraces something a bit different. One could almost say queer. If I didn't think that it was the worst and weirdest relationship between two characters and actors on a film ever.
They're trash people.
Yeah, in our notes,
both of them.
In our planning notes for this episode, one of our points is Charlie and Carrie are the worst.
They're just not good. They're just not good. He kind of, he's obsessed with her, and then they have that whole conversation about how many people have you slept with, and he kind of slut shames her a bit in that he's kind of like, oh, I've only had 9 and all this kind of stuff, and they're just toxic to each other, and she turns up on his wedding day to say that her marriage has failed, and I'm like, and then turns up at his door like, oh, sorry, did I spoil the day?
Yeah,
you did.
She also, let's be honest, she does string him along when she's already engaged. And she drags him along to her wedding dress fitting. Like, they have a weird toxic relationship. I do not like them together, but I'm glad they found their truth. So that was my feeling at the end of the movie. You know what? They found their truth. They realised that marriage wasn't a healthy institution for either of them, and it, Can we then talk? We've just named the idea that maybe marriage isn't for everyone. As Vicars,
yeah, I know, right?
As Vicars, so in the preface to marriage, we talk about how no one should enter marriage lightly, and that marriage is something to be taken seriously. And I really do. I explain this to couples. This isn't something that you just do. Marriage has to mean something for you, and if marriage doesn't mean the right thing for you, then don't make those promises if they're not going to work, if they don't work for you.
Not a good plan. I often talk about in marriage prep and talking about the response to the vows being I will, not I do. Yeah. And I do being the movie thing. And I do is kind of like, well, yeah, I do that. Like, I've done that already.
Or it's in the moment.
I will. Yeah. I will is like, I will continue to. I will carry on loving and honouring you and all this kind of stuff. All those important bits of marriage. Yeah. So, I wonder if this film was rewritten for today, whether there would be marriages that took part that were more like hand-fasting kind of things. I think that would be I can imagine one happening in the forest where there would be part of the comedy would be like a weirdly sensual ritual that everyone else had to witness, and that would be it. And I wonder if they're also, this might be a bit too early, a bit too controversial, if they might talk about polyamorous relationships as well, whether that might be something that is brought up.
Yeah, but they might have a couple who are getting married, but then there's the other partner who is sort of there and part of the ceremony but not legally recognised, I guess. Or a three-way marriage. If
we're basing this around the narrative idea within Four Weddings and a Funeral, that you have got a parody of the traditional, and then your main cast of characters are your kind of somewhat queering the, and queering the conventional, or they're on the sidelines. So I think you could do your hand fasting here in sort of what is traditional weddings now. Yeah. Actually, sort of your big barn dance, big out indoor in the forest, and there's a yurt and marquee and all that kind of thing. So you've got all of that for for wedding one. Wedding two might be something much more traditional. I think it would be really good to throw in some cultural diversity in there. Yeah. So what does it mean when you have a Nigerian wedding and a white? So you've got a Nigerian and a white family. What happens when you throw those together?
Or different religions.
Again, your big classic Christian wedding in a church. What does that look like nowadays? Some differences. The liturgy has changed, but what happens when you have to sing "I am the Lord of the Dance," said he again,
and all things bright and beautiful.
Yeah. The fact that bridesmaids go in now before the bride rather than afterwards, that's something that's changed since 1994. But so you've got all of those things, but then your cast of characters again need to be that weird, diverse group of people, where you do have someone who is completely single and happily so. You've got potentially, instead of just having a under the radar gay couple, you've got an under the radar throuple. And that's what makes up that group of people instead.
I think really having, I think you're right, there would, if this film were made today, you would have the much more greater diversity between the weddings themselves, and I think that would be necessary. You would have maybe one church wedding, but there would be a wedding from a different faith, a wedding at a stately home, and something more hand-fasting. I wouldn't want them to be pastiches of any of them.
No.
What does that mean?
A pastiche is a kind of a comedy interpretation of...
right.
We wouldn't want it to be mocking.
We wouldn't want it to be mocking.
But actually, even the weddings in Four Weddings and a Funeral aren't mocking. They're almost a weird love letter to 90s.
But there's a combination of comedy and... So in the weddings we have in the film, although there is comedy and things go wrong, they're not completely sending up the whole
marriage as an institution
of those couples kind of within it. I think there is still an honesty and a sincerity about those couples where, yes, there's the weird things like one of the weddings has a folk singing duo and everyone's like, oh, this is so weird and awkward. But it's not played up as being wild and wacky. Like, this is just actually quite normal. And it's normal that everyone feels a bit weird when a relative comes up and sings, not, to a best of their ability at a wedding.
Yes. The funeral would be a bit interesting one to see how they would do it now. I've done funerals where people have asked for the poem from Four Weddings and a Funeral. It has been influential in that, and it's a really beautiful poem of.
It's by W.H. Auden, who himself was a gay Christian poet.
Was he? Right.
Yeah, I read something online earlier. He was writing to a bishop in New York about a new liturgy that the bishop had released, and he was saying how dare you introduce this new liturgy? This is why Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer is so good and so important. And also, where is the church linen gone? If it has been sold for the poor, then fine. But if it's for some kind of liturgical decision or doctrinal decision, I object. So anyway, look up to Jordan. He's a fascinating character, but also wrote this really gorgeous poem about grief. So you've got a queer poet representing this queer couple in this very straight film.
And I think if a story were told today, we'd have much more the discussion about breaking from the kind of expected and being different and being more diverse in our experiences would be much more prevalent in a movie. In the movie as it is from the 90s, it's more of an undercurrent, which you as we all did, we can watch this movie, you can watch it and not notice it's there at all, and you kind of read it at surface level.
I think because culture and our society has changed since then, it does put a different challenge before gay couples about how do we relate to marriage. For Gareth and Matthew, marriage wasn't an option. They just had to do life together, known as close friends. Now it's like, well, actually, do we need to get married, even though it's available to us? Do we, is it something that is needed for us to celebrate and to be who we are? And how much of marriage is straight culture? And we're now engaging in straight culture, when actually we might want to have our own traditions and things. So it would raise a really interesting question. And if you had a conflict within that couple of modern day Gareth really wanting to get, to have a big traditional wedding, and modern day Matthew being like, no, we don't need that.
Interesting. I thought it would be the other way around. Like I read in the movie,
I just picked a random name. Sorry. Halfway through that sentence, I was like,
it would be the other
way
around.
Want the wedding potentially, and Matthew who would.
And I think a conflict of, I think Gareth, it's unstated in the movie, but Gareth having a lot more pain, like connected to the church particularly, kind of from not supporting LGBT
I think what could be interesting as well is that actually it could, to what extent is Gareth's attitude towards marriage born out of the fact that he can't have it? And actually, if he could have some kind of ceremony, he would plan it. He would plan a huge party. He would have a massive party where he gets to be that gregarious fellow, and maybe, and Matthew, the quieter one, might be like, well, actually, I just love you. I don't need a big ceremony. And it's and that's what's so tragic. That
maybe they'd end up at Gretna Green. Wouldn't that be fab? If they ran away to Gretna Green to have the little gathering, just the two of them, with witnesses, and then they had a big party afterwards, that would be the perfect combo.
But then there's still a thing about the shame of Gretna Green. Sorry, I mean, the thing is, there's no perfect solution. It's kind of like you go to Gretna Green and
But they might elope somewhere and have a really quiet, intimate ceremony to get married, or even, as many friends have, they've done the paperwork, kind of legally, and they haven't treated that as a wedding, and then had a big celebration.
I disagree with you about Gretna Green. I think it's changed and it's become romanticised. So there isn't the shame aspect with it anymore. That people see it as a romantic. They ran away because they couldn't get married here, and that's the place where love happens, and then they can do something after.
I think what I didn't communicate clearly, I didn't, but was that is how we talk about black joy or trans joy. There's something about, actually, why does it need to be, why should we tuck away our stories into a private place? Like Gretna Green, where you turn up and it's all fine just to do your thing, just the two of you. actually there should, what does it mean? And that in itself is still a debate within the queer community, of how should we do this? Should we just do it ourselves and ignore society and convention? Or should we be leaning into and entering into the spaces that straight people have usually pushed us out of? And saying, actually, we claim a stake in this ourselves too. So it's a fascinating debate that won't ever be solved. But it was just this realization that you've got it's called 4 Weddings and a Funeral, but that funeral in many ways is a wedding. And the tragedy of the gay couple's wedding being a funeral, where that love is spoken.
Publicly amongst friends and family.
Oh, I think I'm going to go cry in a bit now. Anyway. We've talked a lot today about about marriage, those who choose it, those who choose not to have it. We in the church affirm that marriage can be a real gift and blessing to people. But we'd love to hear what you think.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Vicars Watch Dibley. Thank you to Nat for editing our ramblings.
Any opinions expressed are our own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Church of England or any other organisation with which we are affiliated.
If you like our podcast, leave us a review, follow us on social media and share it with your friends. And, as always, bless you for listening.
So, during the wedding rehearsal, the groom approaches the vicar with an unusual offer. So he says, "Look, I'll give you £100 if you change the wedding vows. When you get to the part where I'm supposed to promise to love, honour and obey and be faithful to her forever, I'd appreciate you if you just left that bit out." He passes the minister the £100 and walks away satisfied. On the day of the wedding, when it comes to the time for the groom's vow, the vicar looks at the young man in the eye and says, "Will you promise to prostrate yourself before her, obey her every command and wish, serve her breakfast in bed every morning of your life, and swear eternally before God and your lovely wife that you will not even ever look at another woman as long as you both shall live?" The groom gulps, looks around and says in a tiny voice, "Yes," and leads towards the vicar and hisses, "I thought we had a deal." And then the vicar puts the £100 back in the groom's hand and whispers, "She made me a better offer."